أهلا بكم مشاهدينا الكرام إلى حلقة جديدة من مستقبل الطاقة. هذه ملفاتنا. ما هي آثار انتهاء اتفاق عبور الغاز الروسي للأراضي الأوكرانية نهاية العام الجاري؟ عدد ساعات قياسية لأسعار الكهرباء الأوروبية السالبة هذا العام. موعد حساس ينتظر أوروبا في الأول من يناير 2025. آخر أنبوب يتدفق عبره الغاز من روسيا عبر أوكرانيا ينتهي عقده في ساعة الصفر بهذا التاريخ، وفي حال لم يتم تجديده تكون صفحة من التاريخ قد طويت. سمتها الأساسية الاعتماد الأوروبي الكبير على الغاز الروسي وعبر أوكرانيا تحديدا. صادرات الغاز الروسية إلى أوروبا لم تعد تشكل سوى جزءاً بسيطاً مما كانت عليه قبل الحرب، لكن الجزء الباقي ليس من السهل تعويضه، ولذلك حين دخلت القوات الأوكرانية إلى منطقة كورسك الروسية الشهر الماضي قفزت أسعار الغاز في أوروبا إلى أعلى مستوى لها هذا العام. السبب أن القوات الأوكرانية سيطرت على بلدة سودزا التي تضم آخر محطة كبيرة لتصدير الغاز الروسي عبر أوكرانيا. وعلى الرغم من التطورات العسكرية اتفقت روسيا وأوكرانيا على الإبقاء على تدفق الغاز عبر المحطة حتى الآن، لكن من غير الواضح ما إذا كان بالإمكان تجديده إلى ما بعد نهاية العام الحالي. هذا العقد تم توقيعه عام 2019 ل5 سنوات، ومعلوم أن الاتحاد الأوروبي وضع هدفاً للاستغناء عن الغاز الروسي تماماً بحلول عام 2027، ولذلك فإنه لا يريد تجديد هذا العقد. وكذلك أعلن الرئيس الأوكراني فلوديمير زيلينسكي في يوليو الماضي عدم رغبة بلاده بالتجديد. قد تكون هذه التصريحات نابعة من موقف حقيقي أو مجرد مناورة كلامية تسبق التفاوض، لكن بكل الأحوال إذا انتهى العقد بلا تجديد ستكون مرحلة قد طويت بالنسبة لأوكرانيا التي تمتد على أراضيها واحدة من أضخم شبكات الأنابيب في العالم بطول 22 ألف كيلومتر، أي ما يفوق ضعف المسافة من القاهرة إلى نيويورك. هذه الأنابيب كانت حتى وقت قريب شريان الطاقة لأوروبا لتوليد الكهرباء وتشغيل المصانع وتدفئة المنازل، وعما قريب سيخرج معظمها من الخدمة وتصبح بلا طائل. الحقيقة المريرة بالنسبة لأوكرانيا أنها الأكثر حاجة إلى تجديد العقد، فخزينتها تحصل منه على 800 مليون دولار سنوياً كرسوم مرور، بينما وفرت أوروبا البدائل إلى حد بعيد. التحول الأوروبي بعيداً عن الغاز الروسي مر بسلاسة حتى الآن. خلال العام الماضي تراجع اعتماد أوروبا على روسيا في الغاز الوارد عبر الأنابيب إلى 8% فقط مقارنة ب40% قبل الحرب الأوكرانية. وما صنع الفرق بشكل خاص واردات الغاز المسال التي تدفقت بشكل كبير من الولايات المتحدة في السنوات الأخيرة. وكلنا نذكر أن الرئيس الأمريكي السابق والمرشح الجمهوري الحالي دونالد ترامب كان يسمي الغاز المسال الأمريكي بغاز الحرية، كإشارة إلى أنه سيكون البديل الذي سيحرر أوروبا من الاعتماد على روسيا. وللمفارقة هذا ما حدث بالفعل إلى حد بعيد، والبيانات الأوروبية الأخيرة تؤكد هذا الاتجاه. فقد بات الاتحاد الأوروبي لأول مرة يعتمد على الطاقة المتجددة بنسبة 50% من توليد الكهرباء، وتراجع الغاز إلى المركز الثالث بين مصادر الطاقة خلف الطاقة النووية وطاقة الرياح. كما أن مخزونات غاز الشتاء وصلت إلى 90% بنهاية أغسطس، مستبقة بكثير الموعد المستهدف للوصول إلى هذا المستوى والمحدد مطلع نوفمبر. ومع ذلك فإن بعض دول القارة ما زالت تعتمد بشكل كبير على الغاز الروسي، لا سيما هنغاريا والنمسا وسلوفاكيا. لكن بعض هذه الدول في وسط أوروبا لديها أسبابها السياسية للإبقاء على الصلة الاقتصادية الوثيقة بروسيا. أما أوكرانيا فهي تبحث عن دور بديل في رقعة شطرنج الطاقة الأوروبي عبر إقناع دول أخرى بمد الغاز عبر أراضيها مثل أذربيجان وكازاخستان، لكن السؤال حول جدوى ذلك يبقى كبيرا. إذن اتفاقية عبور الغاز بين روسيا وأوكرانيا تنتهي في الأول من يناير المقبل. كما أسلفنا هناك أطراف متعددة لديها مصالح مرتبطة بانتهاء أو بتجديد هذه الاتفاقية. ففي حال توقف تدفق الغاز الروسي، ماذا سيحدث لأسعار الغاز الأوروبية في حينها؟ وهل تنتفي الحاجة نهائيا لشبكة خطوط الغاز الأوكرانية وتفقد كييف هذا المورد المالي الحرج؟ أم أن أوكرانيا قادرة على جذب الغاز عبر أراضيها من مصادر أخرى؟ وأي الأطراف هو الخاسر الأكبر في حال توقف عبور الغاز الروسي للأراضي الأوكرانية؟ هذه الأسئلة وغيرها طرحتها على ضيفي كبير محللي أسواق الغاز في ICIS توم مارزك مانسر. لنتابع.
Well, I think if Gazprom is unable to supply two principal customers within Central Europe, that's Austria's OMV and Slovakia's SPP, then Gazprom is the biggest loser. That's something like between 12 and 15 billion cubic meters of gas that it is currently supplying those customers on an annualized basis. And so if it can't reach them easily through Ukraine, it may not be able to supply them at all. There are discussions, from different parts of the equation and from the Kremlin directly saying that maybe Gazprom can still supply them through another route. That would still be very difficult, probably more expensive. So whichever way you cut it, Gazprom is probably the one that loses out, even though there are these two customers which potentially would suddenly have less gas arriving on their doorsteps.
So looking at the European equation, to what extent could the end of Russian gas through Ukraine affect Europe and European gas prices moving forward in the near term?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, so potentially if Gazprom is totally unable to supply these two Central European customers, then that is a net loss of supply to the market. And that's one of the considerations that the market has, and one of the reasons we've seen some of that upside in prices recently. So, that would result, certainly if it happened, it would result in prices going up. Some of the forecasting we've done at ICIS says that we'd certainly see a few euros of increase in price if the market is short, based on less Russian gas. And of course, what that means is that it needs to call on more global LNG to fill that deficit. So higher prices and certainly less pipeline gas arriving from the east are the main outcomes of no transit.
Ukraine is exploring the option of getting gas delivered from Azerbaijan so that its pipelines don't become stranded if they decide to cut off Russian gas. How probable is that?
That's one of the biggest questions in the market at the moment, in terms of, is there really discussion going on? Who are the real driving parties within that discussion? We've heard about the idea of Azerbaijan sending gas northwards from Romania, having arrived through Turkey and Bulgaria into Ukraine, and then circling through the storage units and then re-entering the European Union and Slovakia. There's been discussions about Azerbaijan even flowing gas through southern Russia itself, and then re-entering Ukraine in the same location on the Russia-Ukraine border to fully utilize the full length of the transit agreement, so to speak, or the transit pipelines. So there's a lot in play. I would say most parties are relatively tight-lipped in terms of what they're prepared to say has been decided or even agreed in principle, but certainly from the Ukrainian perspective, they don't want Russian gas going through their transit agreement, through their transit pipes. They would very much like someone else to be using those pipes across the breadth of the country, because obviously that is a source of revenue. And it would obviously secure some additional supply into Europe, which, if there's no Russian gas, then, as I already mentioned, some additional sources would be very much welcome.
Well, definitely Ukraine also loses those transit fees if that ends the agreement with Russia. But Europe wants to wean itself off Russian gas. That means it wants to reduce its Russian LNG imports, which remain second to US imports. How difficult is this, and is it making any inroads on cutting off or weaning itself off Russian LNG?
In terms of big policy decisions, it's not making huge inroads. It's made an announcement a few months back that the transshipment of Russian LNG within the European Union will not be permitted from next spring. But that doesn't really impact Russian LNG into Europe. That simply says effectively Russia cannot temporarily park some LNG in a terminal in Belgium or Spain or France to then pick it up again and send it to Asia using a different vessel. So that practice won't be allowed, but it certainly doesn't change the prospect that a number of companies and countries in the western half of Europe still have long-term contracts to offtake LNG from the Yamal LNG project, which has been going for a number of years up in Siberia. So there's no real development there in terms of reducing that dependency. As you say, it's not the biggest dependency that Europe has, but it is a dependency nonetheless.
إذا مشاهدينا نتوقف مع فاصل قصير نتابع بعده في مستقبل الطاقة. بعد إعلانها استيراد الغاز في الشتاء، توقعات بتحول مصر إلى صافي مستورد للغاز لسنوات قادمة. أهلا بكم من جديد إلى مستقبل الطاقة. أسعار الغاز الأوروبية شهدت تقلبات حادة خلال الأسابيع الأخيرة، حيث سجلت أعلى مستوى لها لهذا العام الشهر الماضي، قبل أن تعود الأسعار للانخفاض مطلع سبتمبر. ولكن إلى جانب مسألة اتفاقية عبور الغاز الروسي لأوكرانيا، ما هي العوامل الأخرى التي ساهمت في هذه التذبذبات، لا سيما في ظل استمرار ضعف الطلب الصناعي الأوروبي على الغاز والكهرباء؟ وهل كان لمصر يد في هذا الأمر؟ تابعوا معنا الجزء الثاني من اللقاء مع كبير محللي أسواق الغاز في ICIS توم مارسك مانسر.
I'm sure the macroeconomic situation regarding Europe is being well publicized, and that is certainly feeding through to gas consumption from industrial end users. And we're seeing incredibly low levels, year-on-year decline. So there is a small increase relative to last year, but in terms of the phrase recovery gets used a lot. I would say used incorrectly, because we're nowhere near back to where we were pre-COVID or certainly pre-energy crisis. I think that it seems that gas consumption from industrial end users has probably peaked, and that peaked just before COVID. And so that really is a good bellwether in terms of the overall industrial performance of Europe right now. If it can't consume that, it's not willing to consume that gas based on gas prices being high, but also based on other global petrochemical and geopolitical developments which have transpired over the last 5 or 6 years in terms of new capacity for producing whatever they're producing in say the Middle East, the US Gulf, or indeed in China.
So, Tom, Norway has become the #1 gas supplier to Europe after the Ukraine war. Norway has started its usual maintenance season for its gas fields and network. Its exports to Europe will fall to roughly a third during this period. That could take a few weeks right before entering the heating season. Are the works going as planned, or is there any news about a change or delay in schedules?
So, unlike last year, at the moment, the summer maintenance up in Norway seems to be going according to plan. It was already a smaller summer maintenance than last September, which I guess eased a lot of concerns. And now that we're chugging through it, we're now passing through that period, it looks like everything is going to plan. And fingers crossed, we think that actually by the end of this week that the biggest wave of that maintenance will be over. And that could really put some downward pressure on prices if indeed those outages, if that maintenance is completed on time. So it could be a nice early pre-winter gift to the European market if everything works and is brought back on schedule from Norway.
So European gas prices had a turbulent patch since early August, despite gas storage having exceeded the 90% threshold in Europe. It reached a fresh 2024 high last month before selling off. What are the factors that have led to this increased price volatility in gas in Europe, and why hasn't the storage been able to cushion that? Do you expect this volatility, Tom, to continue as we enter the heating season?
I would say the volatility is here to stay for a good few years, not compared to what we saw in 2022 in the summer shortly after the war started, but certainly compared to what we've seen recently, volatility that we've experienced in the gas market in recent months is, as I say, likely to continue. And that's really is a function of the fact that Europe is so much more dependent on global LNG. So before, LNG was a small part of the supply, and therefore if there was an unplanned outage or an event in the global LNG market, that would only resonate to a small amount in the European gas price. But now that all that marginal gas that Europe needs is coming in the form of LNG, be it from the US or from Egypt or from other parts of the world, the market responds to that. And so we expect that volatility to last. In terms of what is causing it recently, the US is a major source of LNG for the European market. And unfortunately, as part of where the US liquefaction capacity is located, it is in a hurricane path. And so during the hurricane seasons, if it is a busy hurricane season, and summer 2024 looks like a very busy hurricane season, then we have those plants in the US shutting down, and that has a domino effect in terms of the availability of LNG supply into Europe, and that then impacts the European gas price. So that's been a major impact, as have additional sources of unexpected demand in the places such as Egypt.
Well, more on Egypt, the return of this North African country to importing LNG, not only during the summer, but this time into the fall and winter season as well. Is it significant, Tom, in terms of its size to complicate the current balances in the LNG markets? And do you expect that Egypt could become or will become a net gas importer in the coming few years, something that the LNG markets should anticipate and prepare for?
Egypt's a really interesting story, an unfortunate story as it happens in terms of what's happened in recent months and the last year or so. Egypt was producing LNG many years ago and then had to start becoming a net importer 5 or 6 years ago. But then we had this huge development in the Zohr field in Egyptian offshore waters, and that allowed for Egypt once again to really expand its liquefaction capacity and allow Egypt to be part of the solution that Europe really faced during the energy crisis in terms of a new source of, or an additional source of LNG into Europe, and of course, given the proximity into southern Europe, just across the Mediterranean. But that field has really been suffering in terms of its production, and other fields too. And now we're in a situation where we're going from Egypt being able to export all year round to then only being able to export during the winter months, and now having to import during the summer, which is its high gas demand season for air cooling. And now, as you say, the prospect of having to even import during the autumn and winter months. So in many senses, it's not just the fact that Egypt has become an importer, but it's switched from being an exporter. So an additional demand of, say, a few million tons on the import side is actually a net impact in terms of the global balance of maybe 3 or 4 million tons, because it was originally thought to be exporting the similar amount during that period. So it's flipped its balance entirely, and that really has tightened the global LNG market quite a lot. And that, as you say, it's been quite unexpected. The developments in terms of the winter demand for LNG into Egypt, which sometimes arrives via neighbouring Jordan as well. And yeah, I think it's something to continue to expect, at least for a few years, until we see offshore production within Egypt really start to improve. And then there's been no signs of that at all in the last 12, 18 months or so.
True. How has the Asian side of the LNG market been faring this past summer?
Yeah, I think two of the largest LNG importers in Asia, Japan and Korea, were anticipated to be quite weak in their LNG demand. They were historically LNG importers 1 and 2 in the world before China's huge growth in the last 5 or 6 years. But the expectation was that with a renaissance in the nuclear capacity and also lower overall power demand, that LNG imports would fall off quite a lot year on year, 2024 versus 2023. And that's not really been the case. So actually, stubborn demand, let's put it, from those two markets has maybe caught a few people short. And at the same time, that world's #1 LNG importer, China, has seen some record imports into the country in the first half of the year. It slowed a little bit in the second half of the year, but we know China's appetite for LNG can really, really spike in the peak winter months of the Northern Hemisphere. December, January, February, they're very, very strong imports. So it's something that the market will not be assuming won't happen. It's just a case of how high will they go. They really do jump up.
Tom, my final question is regarding the electricity market. European power prices have gone into negative territory this year for a record number of hours. What has been driving this?
Yeah, I mean, it's a staggering statistic to see the number of hours in negative territory on the power markets of Europe. And really, it's a function of two key elements. One, just like gas, we have weak power demand, so consumption is overall lower. And at the same time, policy to bring on new capacity in the form of renewables in solar and wind means we're adding more capacity in the form of wind and solar than we're recovering in overall demand. So with good hydro as well in the mix, better nuclear capabilities year on year, it's really, really making thermal generation, gas-fired generation or coal-fired generation unprofitable. And at times that means the power markets have to go into negative territory to effectively ask suppliers and user suppliers to take the electricity off their hands, giving the money away to incentivize them taking that power off their hands. So more capacity, less demand.
بهذا نصل إلى نهاية مستقبل الطاقة. نلقاكم الأسبوع المقبل في حلقة جديدة. إلى اللقاء.